So as I said, my name is Liz Herman, and I am a trainer and programs analyst with Earthsoft. And today we will be talking about the sample receipt notifications component of the sample planning module, or SPM. We're going to talk about a little bit of the sample receipt notification workflow and some important terminology. We'll discuss a little bit about the related reports and the resample process that might be initiated by any sort of sample receipt issues that come up. And then I'll do a brief demonstration in SPM of some of the highlighted components in the SRN Manager. So the purpose of EQUIS SPM hopefully is not totally foreign to you in this, if you're joining us for this session. Essentially what SPM is used for is to plan your field efforts. So you can of course schedule the various field efforts and track any recurring sampling events. There's the ability to check out your calendar to figure out what kind of upcoming events might be and help mobilize your field crew more easily. You can generate all of your edge field EDD templates from within sample planning module, and that of course allows you to hand those off to your field crews with their field tablets, and they can go out and directly collect information straight into edge, which of course then ends up back into EQUIS for that full circle of tracking. And then finally, once the field effort is underway, you can view the status of completeness of all of those various field activities and the samples as they come back from the laboratory. So that's just, the basics of SPM. But what we're really going to focus on today is the sample receipt notification component of that, which basically presupposes that you've already gone through the first 5 steps of the SPM workflow of planning, defining your plan, setting up your contract with your specific laboratories, planning any necessary tasks and scheduling those tasks, and then going ahead and creating that edge EDD. And once that edge EDD is created and it goes out into the hands of the field crews, that's sort of the no man's land where EQUIS no longer knows what's going on. And that's where the sample receipt notifications come in. It essentially allows you to close the loop of that sort of scary gray area that happens when you don't really have any control or direct knowledge of what's happening, with the folks out in the field. And of course, as the information comes in from those sample receipt notifications, you can run those completeness reports to get a bigger picture of how your full sampling effort is going. So the sample receipt notifications official definition is that it's essentially a notification that's been generated by laboratories to let you know conditions upon receipt of those samples. We've got that example sample receiving checklist there on screen, and it'll tell you when the cooler was received, how the samples were, if there were issues with custody seals or temperature or anything else like that. The sample receipt notifications are not necessarily only going to tell you when bad things happen. Hopefully most of the shipments and all of that will have no problem making it to the laboratory without any problems. Sometimes, of course, that does happen. So the sample receipt notification will allow you to track any sort of issues that might come up. So as I mentioned, it is sort of going to give you the information that's scary outside of EQUIS timeframe. So here's that SRN workflow where we've got this schedule set up in SPM and sort of send the field crews out there with their edge EDD, and they've completed their field sampling, and then those samples go out in transit. And lots of things can happen, of course, once those samples leave the hands of your field collection crews. So in the transit, upon laboratory receipt, things can happen in the lab sometimes, accidental breakage or instruments going down that might cause a delay in your results or all kinds of things like that. And the SRNs are essentially designed to log that kind of information as real time as possible. So when you're going through and verifying your project and your progress within your particular sampling event, you can see, maybe if you're going to have missing data, if you need to go back and set up a resample, or if you've got, maybe some delay to the results because of laboratory capacity or instrumentation issues or things like that. So there are a few components of the SRNs that I want to talk about briefly. The first is the amendment, and this essentially would come from us as the EQUIS user, essentially allowing or alerting the lab rather of any sort of typos or errors in how they've logged those samples. So they might, have flubbed a sample collection date or time, or maybe input the sample code that we've provided with them. And of course, since all of those are very important in tying all of the data back into EQUIS, you certainly want to alert the laboratory of that and sort of note that in your SRN process. The next type of issue that you might want to document is a bottle issue, which would really be any circumstance where a sample is received in a container other than expected. So even if the laboratory provided you with all of the necessary appropriate containers, you might have breakage out in the field where you kind of have to sort of MacGyver it and figure something out on the fly. And this is the kind of way that you can determine or log information where there might be an issue with the container that you ended up using, and whether or not the analysis can go ahead and proceed or not. The next type of issue is just a general issue, and that could be an issue with an entire sample delivery. So an entire cooler shows up hot. Maybe you have 3 or 4 coolers in a particular delivery, and only 3 show up on the expected day, and one of them is waylaid someplace at some shipping station or something like that, and that one would come in hot, and you might decide that you need to cancel the entire set because of the way that the coolers have been packed or something like that. So that general issue would impact your entire sample delivery. And then finally, there is the sample issue, which would be specific to an individual sample, and maybe even down to the analytical level, which might include something like a broken or missing container, some sort of holding time violation, again with those waylaid coolers, or an improper container. And these sample issues may or may not actually cause you to decide to cancel analysis. You might say, it's okay, we'll just flag the data as maybe unusual, but we'll still want to have this for informational purposes. Or maybe there isn't any volume to proceed. All of that information can be recorded within the SRN. So there are essentially 3 different workflow components in the SRN, and that is the SRN Manager, the SRN EDD format, and then of course the SRN Reports. And those SRN Reports are really what allow you to basically take all of the information that you've stored using the SRN process and deliver it to your decision makers for your projects. There are several EIAs that have very similar names related to overdue and past turnaround or past max turnaround and things like that. And those can help you, of course, track your on-time delivery, which can certainly be really helpful if you've got, one of those many-headed beast type projects with a really tight schedule that you need to keep an eye on. And then those last 3 reports at the bottom of the list, the SPM resample report allows you to generate the list of any samples that you have basically started the resample process on, and basically deliver that to your decision makers so that they can decide whether or not to send anybody out into the field for that resample effort, or if it's maybe not worth the cost. The SRN issues report we'll take a look at here in a little bit, as well as the completeness report detailed. And both of those will include information specific that shows up in the SRN Manager that either will tell you everything about the particular SRNs that you would see in the SRN issues report, or just maybe some analyses that were not able to be performed, which is what you'll see in the completeness report. So I mentioned the SRN EDD format relatively in passing, and in a perfect world, the ideal laboratory workflow would essentially include your laboratory generating and providing an EDD of any SRNs sort of as part of the package that they send you when they receive samples. So, typically you might receive a copy of the chain of custody, maybe a PDF of the samples and how they were logged into the laboratory's LIMS. And then, like I said, in a perfect world, you might include, or they might include, an SRN EDD so that you can load any receipt information directly into EQUIS using that SRN format that is delivered out of the box with SPM. And once all of that information is in EQUIS, of course, you've got those automated EIA reports that could alert you of any issues with, holding time, broken samples, temperature issues, that kind of thing. Okay. So if you've got that level of automation, that's terrific. But if you don't, that's okay too, because I'll show you what it looks like now in the SRN Manager to basically hop in and log information that might have occurred or that the laboratory has provided to you related to sample delivery issues. So the SRN Manager is available in this plan ribbon in the upper corner up here, upper right-hand corner. And so if you click on that, it will pull up your SRN Manager. And the SRNs are organized by work order or laboratory SDG. And you can see we've got a handful of work orders that have already been recorded here, as well as some SRNs that are related to those. Now, remember what I said, you don't necessarily have to have an SRN that tells you bad news. You can certainly log information in your SRNs about your samples just arriving, the condition upon receipt and all that kind of thing, and just call it good. Just sort of as closing that loop so that you know all of the conditions and that happened when those samples were received. Okay, but when you create the new work order in the SRN Manager, you can set your status to new, or once you've reviewed it, perhaps you want to call it archived or complete and add your review date to that as well. You can add your associated work order samples, and all of this information can be gleaned from your Edge EDD as well, that field EDD. You essentially would select the target, maybe chain of custody that was generated out of Edge, and it'll allow you to select every single container, or every single sample rather, that would be included in that particular delivery. So you can see with this specific chain of custody piece of information that there's some additional information about what happened when the cooler was received. So it was received on the 16th of March at maybe not midnight. I think maybe that needs to be changed right there. But the lab security seal or the custody seal was broken upon receipt, and the cooler temperature was 12.4 degrees. And so probably that might mean because either the broken custody seal or the elevated cooler temp that you might decide you want to cancel all analyses and set up a resample. Within the SRN Manager, you can do that. We can see what each of the SIS sample codes and sample names are in terms of our EQUIS associations. And then if I hop on over to the SRNs tab, I can look at the specific issues related to maybe the individual cooler, or rather the entire issue for the general issues like I mentioned earlier, or if there are individual sample issues that have been noted. It is under the sample issues that you can also add the lab sample ID. So if I had that handy, I could, go ahead and populate that. I'm just free typing in here now, and that would give you your lab sample IDs. So you can see that direct association of your sample code to your sample name to your lab sample ID. Okay, and let me free up some space here. If there are any issues within your individual samples, you can set up your sample issues, list any sort of bottle nonconformities that have happened, or address any tests that might not be able to be analyzed based on the container issues or things like that that may have come up. Okay, so that's pretty handy. Additionally, if you perhaps had a circumstance maybe where you provided a container that'll work for an analysis, but it might end up biasing some particular analytes within an analytical suite, instead of having your sample issue impact maybe an entire method analyte group, you can essentially, toggle off a couple of analytes that might be, biased low and ultimately you wouldn't want to analyze for, and essentially just check those off so that they aren't performed. And just say, I don't want you to be performed. And maybe we'll say silver biased low. Okay, I'm just making stuff up. Okay, and in doing that, it'll uncheck the performed piece of information. It'll give you a little note of why that's going to happen. Okay. Additionally, once you've set up all of the information related to your cooler receipt, where you've got your number of samples and, of course, any sort of remarks related to the particular full delivery, you can set up any amendments. So in this case, we have an amendment that says essentially cancel all analyses. And within this amendment, we have some reasons that you can set up in your RT lookup tables or on the fly right here, and essentially say, cancel all analyses like with this situation because custody seals are broken, or perhaps maybe we're okay with the custody seals being broken. This is just informational stuff anyway. We could go ahead and say, rather, proceed with the requested analysis, and just make sure that all of that information is logged within Equus. So maybe later down the line, we want to see why the data might be flagged funny or why the data isn't there. In the case of something being canceled, this SRN amendment will show you custody seals are broken and the cooler was hot, so we had to cancel. Okay. And nope, I don't want to save. And finally, associated with all of the SRNs when you're setting up and defining issues that might have occurred when the laboratory received the samples, you can also set up resample requests. And we've got a couple of resample requests in here for, it looks like just one sample. But essentially what you do here is just say, I want to set up a resample request, maybe for this sample. I'm just going to select it arbitrarily. And it'll just add it to the list so that it can be put in front of the decision makers, the folks who are going to be able to say, yes, we need to remobilize and go collect those samples again since they all were received hot, that kind of thing. Okay, but it is important to note that when you set up a resample request from within the SRN Manager, it doesn't automatically create a new task in SPM and go through that whole process. There is definitely a manual side of things to that, and that is by design. It certainly would be nice if it just sort of went through and did all of that for you, but because of the costs and all of that that might be related to the resampling efforts, that's the kind of thing that we really want to put in front of somebody to make that decision, and then have it be very intentional that it ends up being added back into SPM. Okay. The other thing that you can do within the SRNs is record additional issues that might come up. Maybe the laboratory emails us a week into the turnaround time and says, we're really sorry, an analyst was in our walk-in and broke an entire box of your liter ambers, so the analysis for this analytical suite won't be able to be performed. That kind of information can be added. So you would just come into maybe a sample-specific issue and say, for maybe a bottle nonconformity in that kind of circumstance, you can say, let me switch to the MAG display mode there. Add that bottle nonconformity and say, it's an issue, analyst broke sample volume, no volume left to analysis, no volume left for analysis, how about that? Okay, and then you would select your target MAG that the problem was, and note the appropriate containers. In this case, they're nitric preserved polys. It would be pretty tricky for an analyst to break those, but I guess it's possible. Okay, and once you add that information in there, you can say, okay. And in checking that BNC impact right there, I can come on over to my test list, and you'll actually see that it has unchecked all of the performed box all the way down here, because what we've said now is can't do the analysis at all because the container for that particular test got broken. Okay, so it sort of smart updates that kind of information, and it's specific to an individual, either an entire MAG or to an individual analyst, like I showed earlier. Okay, so this particular example is basically the whole story of all the bad things that might happen in a particular SRN. So I'll go ahead and save this and close on out of it. But I did also want to show you some of the reports that allow you to gather more information about SRNs once those have been processed. So I'll come on over to the Reports tab in SPM. And the reports I already have open here, so I'll check those out, but I want to show you where some of these guys are available. So I'll go ahead and select Open Report Actions. And if I scroll on over, you can see that we've got these series of EIAs where we've got our overdue results, overdue SDGs, overdue SRNs, etc. All these guys are EIAs that you can set up once you've published that DLL to the database. You can set those up in Enterprise so that information is coming to you on whatever schedule or trigger that you've decided to have. But additionally, the one that we're going to check out today is the completeness summary, or the completeness report detailed, as well as the SPM SRN issues report. Okay, those are the two that I like to check out today. So the first report that we'll look at is the SPM completeness report detailed. And I've selected my plan code for this data set already. It starts at the beginning of my sampling event and sort of goes on into the end. And I've selected my target SPM task codes. I know that I'll have interesting smattering of data showing up here in terms of completeness and all of that. So if you're familiar with the completeness report, you can see that we've got a summary of our tasks that may or may not be fulfilled, as well as a summary of how our field effort is going. So it looks like we've got 100% completed for the first 3 tasks here, but we haven't gotten any analytical data yet. And we haven't gotten any sort of field EDDs back from the field crews on the last 2 tasks there, which is okay. I think those aren't actually supposed to have happened yet. So you can check out, of course, the field samples. And when I check out this field samples tab, it'll show me if there is an SRN issue with that nice little orange box. And I can scroll on over and see if it's going to provide me any additional information. The analytical results tab will tell you if you've got some completed data, if there's incomplete data, or maybe the laboratory is reporting something you didn't want them to. Of course, that's going to show up in this as well as an unplanned analyte. And then finally, under SRN issues, we can see those SRN details that I added here just moments ago. So for all of our metals, they're not going to be performed. Remember, I had that pretend breakage from a clumsy analyst. And then I also had that little note that I said about silver being biased low because of the container type. Okay, so it's essentially giving me all of the details about problems that are coming up. These are the analyses that cannot be performed. Okay. Now, if I come back to my sample planning module and pop on over to that SRN issues report, I've set my inquiry date to today, and my review days I've set out to 60 because I want my start date to be the very beginning of this sampling event, which is the 1st of March. And then I've selected just the first 3 task codes in this case that I want to check out in this report, and I'll go ahead and say go again. And in this case, it's actually split out the details for the SRNs across each tab. So this first one is going to show me this particular work order for one laboratory, and I can check out some more details about that. So it looks like in this case, cooler was received with seals intact at an acceptable temperature, and the remark says samples received intact with no issues. So that's great news. Looks like we'll be able to get our data back for that particular data set relatively easily, hopefully, crossing our fingers. Then we've got our next tab where we can see all kinds of information that showed up. This is the one where we kind of, the sky fell on it. You can see cooler was received, 10 samples were in that cooler, the seal was broken and the temperature was hot. We've also got a note with the amendment saying cancel all analyses because we don't want to proceed with the analysis there. And then we've got our general issues and bottle nonconformities. So you can basically see, yep, the analyst broke that sample volume, so we're not going to go ahead and perform any of these particular target tests. And then finally, this last tab, we've got a slightly different set of issues that showed up here. It looks like the chain of custody was marked for dissolved analysis in error. Initially, the laboratory said, hey, you sent us dissolved volume with visible sediment in the container. We can't, that's clearly not dissolved. And so maybe we went and looked at the project and said, oh, somebody just mismarked that on the chain of custody and now analyze on a total basis only kind of thing. And then we've got another circumstance where the laboratory measured the pH upon receipt for that particular sample, and it was neutral. So even though the label indicates that the sample was preserved, they're going to go ahead and try to attempt preservation and then proceed with the analysis. Okay, so all of that information is information that maybe the laboratory has provided to me or to you, whoever is collecting this SRN information, and it has been added using that SRN Manager or the SRN EDD format. And then we've got this report that basically gives us all of the details about what happened and why, and maybe what kind of activities we might need to take, you know, sort of in the next step. Okay. And then finally, the one last report that I wanted to show is the resample request. Let's see if I can find it here. Here we go, SPM resample report. And this will essentially allow us to, need to adjust my start range here a little bit, to the 1st of March. And the laboratory SDGs, I'll go ahead and select all 3 of these and see if there are any resamples that came up from these particular work orders. And there we have them. We've got a couple of different resamples that might be necessary. And this essentially, you can set up an EIA, or you can put it, if you want to, as like a traffic light widget or something like that. If there's a resample that shows up, it shows up as red on your traffic light. Okay, essentially allowing you to see this kind of information at a glance, you know, on the enterprise side of things, if you were so inclined. But putting that in front of the decision makers so that they can decide whether or not they're going to go ahead and authorize remobilization for recollection, that kind of thing. Okay. Of course, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to deal with this kind of thing, but it's always good to have some sort of contingencies to deal with any sort of issues that might come up from the field and all of that. So I did want to let you know of some of the references that can help you sort of work through the SRN component of SPM. We've got 2 different help documentations on that, and those are actually pretty good in terms of the content that they have and sort of walking you through and the kind of information that can be included in that. I did fail to mention that the information from the SRN Manager ends up being stored in specific SRN tables. So of course, if you want to check out that information directly in the EQUIS database, you can do that as well. So yeah, I'll go ahead and take questions now. It looks like we've got a couple of questions here. John asks, are you aware of any laboratories providing the SRN EDD? I believe that we have at least one client in Australia that is getting an SRN EDD, but I'm not sure which laboratory they receive that from. There's at least one client, but possibly others that are able to do that. The SRN EDD, actually, let me show you what that looks like. This actually happens to have the screenshots in it, so you can sort of see how they're related. But essentially what the laboratory would provide to you is the work order information, any sort of chain of custody information, and then if there were, you know, maybe general issues or bottle issues, that kind of thing, all of that has a different table within that EDD where they can populate that. Okay. Looks like Carl has a question. Which laboratories have Earthsoft involved in the design and development of the SRN workflows and EDD formats? Are there any labs that are known to actually have the capabilities to provide compatible SRN EDDs for the workflow described, especially for reporting issues in the lab post-login process, like the container and test issues? Like I said, there's at least one in Australia, I think, that is providing that. In terms of the generation of this EDD, I think that it's most of the larger laboratories probably would be able to generate at least a fair amount of this from their LIMS in terms of, you know, information about the method analytic, or not method analytic group, analytic method and lists and things like that, that might be impacted with any sort of bottle nonconformities or things like that. But it's possible that this would be something that they would be creating manually on their end as well. So I'm not sure. I can definitely find out, Carl, specifically who involved and get that information for you. It's a good question. And thank you so much, everyone. I hope to see you next week. Have a great day.